crimson sunset bled across the Dakota sky. Jessamine Morgan clutched a crumpled letter, her knuckles white. The paper felt like the last piece of a life that had been torn away. One minute she was a Boston wife. The next, a widow with nothing but a worthless piece of paper and a claim to a homestead she'd never seen. The stagecoach left her in the dust of a town called Redemption Creek. It was a cruel joke. There was no redemption here. Only the end of the line. The town was dying with the sun. Cowboys stumbled into the saloon. No one looked twice at the woman in the faded traveling dress, standing alone next to her single trunk. She was invisible, a ghost before her time. Her late husband Charles had done this to her. His debts, his secrets, they had followed him to the grave and pushed her out here, to the edge of the world. "Madam, you look lost." The voice was deep, rolling out of the dusk like low thunder. She turned. A man on a chestnut stallion, a black silhouette against the blood-red sun. He was the darkness made real. His face was hidden by the brim of his hat, but he didn't need a face. His posture said it all. This was a man who owned the ground he stood on. "I'm looking for the Tucker property," she said. Her voice didn't even tremble. She was surprised by that. "A few miles north of town." The silhouette was still for a long moment. The silence stretched, thin and tight. "The old Tucker place," he said. Not a question, but a statement. A judgment. "Nobody's lived there for years." "Someone does now," Jessamine shot back, the words sharper than she intended. "I do." He swung down from the saddle, a fluid motion, like a hawk dropping from the sky. He moved closer, and the last sliver of light caught his face. It was a map of hard miles and harsh sun. But his eyes, there was something in his eyes, not kindness, caution. "Isaac Blackwood," he said, his hand outstretched. It was calloused, strong. "Sheriff of Redemption Creek. Jessamine Morgan." She took his hand. It was a mistake. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. "Widow." His eyes, a startling, piercing blue, didn't leave her face. "That place isn't fit for a stray dog, Mrs. Morgan, let alone a lady. I have nowhere else to go, Sheriff." The words tasted like ash. "So it will have to be fit enough." A muscle jumped in his jaw. He looked at her trunk, then back at her. It was a look that weighed and measured. She felt stripped bare under that gaze. "It's almost dark. You can't go out there alone." He seemed to be arguing with himself. "Boarding house is full. I have a spare room, above my office. You can stay the night. I'll take you out there in the morning." Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to stand on her own 2 feet, even if the ground was crumbling beneath them. But the coming night was cold and dark, and she was so tired. "That's kind of you, Sheriff." As he loaded her trunk onto his horse, she felt the eyes of the town on her. A woman alone. With the sheriff. The whispers had already started. She had a feeling they would never stop. Maybe coming here was the worst mistake of her life. But it was the only move she had left to make. The room above the jail was small, clean, and smelled of pine soap and solitude. Isaac set her trunk down and stood in the doorway, filling it completely. "It's not much," he said. His voice was unreadable. "It's more than I have," she answered, and the truth of it hit her like a physical blow. When he left, she sank onto the narrow bed, and the tears finally came. Silent, hot tears for the man she thought she'd married, for the life she thought she'd had. But as she cried, a new feeling rose up from the grief, hard and sharp, determination. Charles had put her in this nightmare. She would be the one to wake herself up. The next morning, the smell of bacon and strong coffee pulled her from a restless sleep. She dressed in her most practical brown cotton and went downstairs. Isaac was at a small stove in the corner of his office, his back to her. He was a man who took up space, solid and unmovable. He glanced over his shoulder as she entered. A flicker of something, appreciation, crossed his face before he stamped it out. "Figured you'd be hungry," he said, nodding toward a small table set for two. They ate in silence. The food was simple, but it was the first real meal she'd had in a week. It felt like a communion, a shared moment of peace before the storm she knew was coming. "Mrs. Morgan," he started, his voice low. "I need to warn you. The Tucker place, it's got a history. Old man Tucker didn't just die. He disappeared 3 years back. My husband purchased it 6 months ago," she said, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. "He said the man died of old age." Isaac's expression was grim. "Your husband was told a lie, or he was part of one. That land isn't just empty. It's haunted by unanswered questions." The implication hung in the air between them. Her husband hadn't just been a fool, he'd been a liar. An hour later, they rode out of town. The prairie was beautiful, a sea of grass and wildflowers under a vast, empty sky. But the beauty was threatening. It was a wilderness that could swallow a person whole. Then Isaac pulled his horse to a stop. "There it is." Her heart didn't just sink, it plummeted. The cabin was a skeleton picked clean by the wind and the sun. The roof sagged like a broken back. The corral was nothing but splintered wood. It wasn't a home. It was a grave. "I can take you back," Isaac said, his voice soft. "We can arrange passage back east." She looked at the ruin that was supposed to be her future. Then she looked at the sheriff. His offer was a life raft, but she'd be adrift on his charity, and she was done with that. "No," she said, her spine turning to steel. "This is mine. I'll make it a home." His eyes held something like respect, but it was buried under a mountain of concern. "This will be hard work." "I'm stronger than I look, Sheriff." As they got closer, she saw it. Nailed to the door of the cabin was a sun-bleached coyote skull. A warning. This wasn't just neglect. This was a message. Someone didn't want her here. The inside of the cabin was worse. Dust lay thick as a shroud. But it was the cold that got to her. A deep, bone-chilling cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the cold of a place where something terrible had happened. Isaac brought in her trunk, his presence a small warmth in the oppressive chill. "I can't leave you here," he said. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement of fact. "Not like this." He pointed to the hearth. The stones were scorched black, far darker than any normal fire would cause. And etched into the stone, almost hidden beneath the soot, was a symbol. A snake eating its own tail. "What is that?" she whispered. Isaac's face was a stone mask. "That's Tucker's mark. He put it on everything he owned." He paused, his gaze fixed on the symbol. "Your husband, did he have any enemies?" The question was a bucket of ice water. "He had debts, gambled everything away. That's why I'm here." "Debts can be a powerful enemy, Mrs. Morgan." He ran a hand over the rough stone. "I have some lumber, enough to patch that roof, a new stove. Let me help, not for payment, as a neighbor." She wanted to say no, but the coyote skull on the door and the chilling symbol on the hearth told her she was in over her head. She was no longer just a widow starting over. She was a woman who had walked into the middle of a story she didn't understand. And Sheriff Isaac Blackwood seemed to be the only one who might have the missing pages. For 2 weeks, Isaac was a constant presence. He arrived with the sun and left with the stars. They worked in a rhythm that was almost comfortable, patching the roof, mending the fences, clearing the land. But beneath the surface, there was a tension, a constant thrum of unspoken questions. He taught her how to handle a rifle, not just to hunt, but to defend herself. "Who am I defending myself from?" she asked one afternoon, the weight of the steel heavy in her hands. Out here, he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. You defend yourself from everything. The town watched them. The whispers grew louder. The widow and the sheriff. It was a scandal. But Jessamine found she didn't care. The fear was a bigger monster than the gossip. She found small things. A spent bullet casing near the well. A piece of torn cloth snagged on a fence post, far from any trail. Signs of a struggle. Signs that old man Tucker hadn't gone quietly. One evening, sitting on the newly repaired porch, she finally asked him the question that had been burning in her mind. You knew him, didn't you? Tucker. Isaac stared out at the prairie, his face unreadable. He was my father's best friend, taught me how to track. He was more of a father to me than my own ever was. His voice was low, filled with a raw grief that was years old, but still sharp. When he disappeared, the last sheriff wrote it off. Said he probably just wandered off and died in the hills. I knew better. Tucker wasn't the wandering off type. The revelation struck her. This wasn't just a cold case for him. It was personal. That's why you became sheriff, she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. I became sheriff to find out who killed him, and why. He turned to look at her, his blue eyes intense in the fading light. And then you showed up, Mrs. Morgan, with a deed to his land, signed over by a husband who died suddenly. You have to admit, it's a strange coincidence. The trust she had started to build with him fractured. He wasn't just helping her, he was investigating her. My husband was a gambler from Boston. He wouldn't know a Dakota homesteader from a hole in the ground. He was swindled. Was he? Isaac's voice was gentle, but the question was sharp as a razor. Or did he know exactly what he was buying? Before she could answer, a flicker of movement in the distance caught her eye. 3 riders, moving fast across the prairie, heading not for the town, but directly for her homestead, directly for them. Isaac was on his feet in an instant, his hand on his gun. Get inside, he commanded, and bar the door. The riders weren't just passing by, they were coming with a purpose. And suddenly, Jessamine knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were coming for something her husband had left behind. The riders stopped at the edge of her property, 3 dark figures against the twilight. They didn't come closer. They just sat on their horses, watching, waiting. It was a message, a display of power. We know where you are. Isaac stood on the porch, a rifle in his hands, a silent challenge. The air crackled with tension. Jessamine watched from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The men stayed for what felt like an eternity, then wheeled their horses around and galloped away, disappearing into the darkness. Who were they? She asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. The Harrove gang, Isaac said, his eyes still scanning the empty horizon. Vultures. They only circle when they smell blood. He finally turned to her, his face grim. They've been a plague on this territory for a year. Robberies, murder. But they've never come this far south. Not until now. Not until she arrived. The unspoken words hung between them. They think I have something, she said. They do, Isaac agreed. The question is, what is it? That night, Isaac didn't go back to town. He sat in the rocking chair he'd made for her, rifle across his lap, a guardian in the shadows. Jessamine lay in her bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The cabin no longer felt like a potential home. It felt like a trap. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, was the sound of approaching danger. She thought about the crumpled letter in her trunk, the last letter from Charles. It had been full of strange phrases, talk of a serpent's treasure and a legacy of dirt and sky. At the time, she'd dismissed it as the ramblings of a dying man. Now she wasn't so sure. The next morning, Isaac rode into town for supplies. "Don't open the door for anyone," he warned, his eyes lingering on her face. There was a new emotion there, something beyond suspicion. It looked like fear, not for himself, but for her. While he was gone, she tore her trunk apart. At the very bottom, sewn into the lining, was a small, leather-bound journal. It wasn't Charles's handwriting. The script was older, more deliberate. She opened it. The first entry was dated 3 years ago. It was Old Man Tucker's journal. She devoured the pages. Tucker hadn't just been a homesteader. He'd been a geologist. He'd found something on this land, not gold, something far more valuable. Silver, a massive, undiscovered vein of it running right under her cabin. He wrote about his excitement, his plans. He also wrote about his fear. He told one person about his discovery, a businessman from back east who was helping him secure the mining rights. A man named Charles Morgan. The floor seemed to drop out from under her. Charles hadn't been swindled. He had been the swindler. He had partnered with the Harrove gang to scare Tucker off his land, or worse. Tucker's last entry was chilling. "Morgan is coming with his friends. I fear they do not mean to negotiate. I have hidden the survey maps. The serpent will guard them." The serpent eating its own tail, the symbol on the hearth. She ran to the fireplace, her hands trembling. She pushed against the stone, searching for a seam, a crack. Her fingers found a loose edge. She pulled. A large stone swung inward, revealing a dark cavity. Inside was a tin box. She had just pulled it out when she heard the sound of a horse outside. It was too soon for Isaac to be back. She froze, clutching the box. A heavy knock sounded at the door. "Mrs. Morgan," a voice called out. It wasn't a stranger. It was Deputy Billy Hawkins. "Sheriff sent me. Said to check on you. There's been trouble in town." Jessamine's mind raced. Isaac had told her not to open the door for anyone, but this was his deputy. Refusing would seem suspicious. She quickly hid the tin box and the journal under a loose floorboard and opened the door. Billy stood there, a friendly smile on his face, but his eyes were shifty. They darted past her, scanning the inside of the cabin. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "The Harrove gang," he said, stepping inside without being invited. "They hit the bank. Sheriff's organizing a posse. He sent me to make sure you were safe, and to ask you something. He said to ask if you'd found your husband's legacy yet." The blood drained from her face. It was a code, a test, and she had failed. Isaac would never have sent that message. Billy's smile vanished. His hand dropped to the gun at his hip. "Looks like you have. Now where is it?" He lunged for her. Jessamine reacted on pure instinct. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove and swung it with all her might. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. She stood over him, panting, the skillet still gripped in her hand. The friendly young deputy was a traitor. The law in Redemption Creek was compromised. She was truly alone. And then she heard more horses approaching. A lot of them. The rest of the Harrove gang was coming. She had seconds to act. Dragging Billy's unconscious form was impossible. She took his gun and his ammunition belt. Then she scrambled for the hidden box and Tucker's journal. She fled out the back of the cabin, running for the cover of the rolling hills just as the first members of the Harrove gang rode into her yard. She didn't look back. The homestead was lost. It was no longer a sanctuary, however flawed. It was the center of a spider's web, and she had just escaped from the heart of it. She ran, clutching the evidence that had gotten one man killed and would surely get her killed too if she was caught. She had to find Isaac. She had to warn him. He wasn't just heading into a fight with outlaws. He was riding into a betrayal. The prairie was a harsh, unforgiving landscape. Jessamine ran until her lungs burned, then slowed to a determined walk, pushing north toward Eagle Ridge, the landmark Isaac had pointed out to her on their first ride out. She had to believe he'd be with the posse, searching for the gang. She didn't let herself think about what would happen if the gang found him first. Hours bled into one another. The sun beat down, and her water was running low. But the fear was a worse thirst. The journal and the tin box, tucked into a sack on her back, felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. They were a death sentence. As dusk began to settle, she heard the distant sound of gunshots, a series of sharp cracks that echoed through the hills. It was coming from the direction of Eagle Ridge. The posse had found the gang, or the gang had found the posse. She pushed herself harder, scrambling up a rocky incline. From the top she could see the scene below. A small canyon. It was an ambush. The Harrove gang had the high ground, firing down on a small group of men pinned behind some rocks. She saw Isaac's chestnut stallion, riderless. Her heart stopped. Then she saw him. Isaac, returning fire from behind a boulder, trying to cover the retreat of another man who was wounded. He was outnumbered. It was a slaughter. Jessamine's mind, once filled with Boston literature and social etiquette, was now terrifyingly clear. There was no time for grief or panic. She had Billy's rifle. She had a good vantage point, and she had the element of surprise. She rested the rifle on a rock, just as Isaac had taught her. She took a deep breath, lined up the sights on a man reloading on the ridge opposite her, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The man on the ridge crumpled and fell. The sudden shot from a new direction threw the gang into confusion. It gave Isaac the opening he needed. He shoved the wounded man towards safety and made a break for better cover. But another outlaw had him sighted. Jessamine fired again, the shot going wide, but it was enough to make the man duck. It wasn't enough. A bullet slammed into Isaac's side. He staggered, falling behind a cluster of rocks. Jessamine's world narrowed to the rifle in her hands. She fired again and again, no longer aiming carefully, just trying to provide covering fire to keep their heads down. The outlaws, not knowing how many people were shooting at them from the ridge, hesitated. It was the only chance she would get. She scrambled down the treacherous slope, sliding on loose rock, her hands raw and bleeding by the time she reached the canyon floor. The gang was regrouping, preparing to storm the rocks. She ran toward Isaac, praying she wasn't too late. He was alive, barely. His face was pale, his shirt soaked in blood. "Jessamine," he rasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You're supposed to be at the homestead." "Your deputy is part of the gang," she said, ripping a piece of her dress to press against the wound. The whole thing was a trap. His eyes hardened with a cold fury, even through the pain. "Billy, we have to move, now." He nodded, gritting his teeth as she helped him to his feet. Leaning on her, he stumbled toward a narrow crevice in the canyon wall she'd spotted from above. It was their only hope. The Harrove gang, realizing they'd been fooled by a single shooter, let out a furious cry. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them as Jessamine and Isaac squeezed into the dark, narrow space. They were trapped, wounded, and cornered. But as Jessamine reloaded the rifle in the darkness, she felt that same cold determination rise within her. They had come to her home. They had tried to kill the only man who had shown her true kindness. They thought she was a helpless city widow. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The crevice was barely wide enough for them to stand single file. It led deeper into the rock, a natural tunnel carved by water and time. It was their salvation and their prison. "We can't stay here," Isaac grunted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "They'll wait us out." "Is there another way out?" she asked, her voice echoing in the tight space. "There's an old cave system. Tucker showed it to me once. It should connect, somewhere on the other side of this ridge." He leaned heavily against the cold stone wall. If I can remember the way. They plunged into the oppressive darkness, Jessamine leading the way, one hand on the damp wall, the other holding Billy's revolver. Isaac followed, his breathing a painful metronome in the silence. The air grew stale and cold. It smelled of wet earth and secrets. "Tucker's journal," she said, needing to fill the silence to keep Isaac conscious. "I found it, and the survey maps. It was silver, Isaac, a huge vein of it. Charles knew. He was working with Harrove." Isaac didn't seem surprised. "I always suspected. Charles wasn't just in debt. He was a predator. He bought this land knowing it was stained with blood. He sent you here, Jessamine. He was using you as bait to draw them out or to be his key." The truth was a bitter pill. Her late husband hadn't just left her destitute. He had offered her up as a sacrifice. They stumbled on through the darkness for what felt like miles. Isaac's strength was failing. Twice he collapsed, and it took all her strength to get him back on his feet. He was fading, his words becoming slurred. "The serpent guards them," he mumbled, his head lolling against her shoulder. "That's what Tucker always said." "I know, Isaac. I found the box." "No, not just the box," he whispered. "The cave. Look for the serpent." They rounded a corner and saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. A way out. As they got closer, they saw it was a narrow opening, partially blocked by a rockfall. But it was the markings on the wall that made Jessamine stop. Carved into the stone, illuminated by the sliver of moonlight from outside, was the same symbol from the hearth, a snake eating its own tail. "This is it," Isaac breathed. They squeezed through the opening and found themselves in a small, hidden cavern. In the center of the cavern, a thin stream of water trickled from the ceiling into a clear pool. It was a secret oasis, a place of impossible beauty, hidden in the heart of the rock. And it was also a dead end. There was no other exit. The hope that had sustained them evaporated. They had traded one trap for another. Isaac collapsed, his body finally giving out. Jessamine rushed to his side, cradling his head in her lap. He was burning with fever. "Jessamine," he whispered, his eyes struggling to focus on her face. "The journal, the maps. You have to get them to the U.S. Marshal in Clearwater. Don't trust anyone in Redemption Creek. It's not just Billy. The rot goes deeper." "Hush now," she soothed, trying to stop the bleeding with the last of her makeshift bandages. "You'll tell him yourself." He gave a weak, grim smile. "Not likely." His hand found hers, his grip surprisingly strong. "You came for me. No one's ever done that before." "I couldn't leave you," she said, tears streaming down her face. As she held him, her eyes scanned the cavern again, desperately searching for something, anything she might have missed. Her gaze fell upon the pool of water. The carving of the serpent on the wall wasn't just above the pool. Its tail seemed to point directly into it. The serpent guards them. She laid Isaac's head down gently and waded into the freezing water. It came up to her waist. Reaching down, her fingers brushed against the smooth, sandy bottom. And then she felt it. Not sand, not rock, a perfectly straight edge. She dug frantically, the icy water numbing her hands. It was a heavy iron ring, set into a stone slab at the bottom of the pool. An underwater door. It was Tucker's final secret. His serpent's treasure wasn't just the silver. It was this hidden escape route. With a surge of adrenaline, she pulled on the ring. The slab was impossibly heavy. She braced her feet and pulled with every ounce of her strength. Slowly, groaning in protest, the stone slab lifted, revealing a dark, water-filled passage below. A way out. But just as the slab opened, she heard a sound from the passage they'd just come through. The scraping of boots on rock. Harrove and his men had found them. "There's nowhere left to run, Sheriff," a voice boomed, echoing through the cavern. Jessamine's blood ran cold. She looked at the dark, underwater passage. Then she looked at Isaac, unconscious and bleeding on the cavern floor. She couldn't carry him through there. They were trapped. Harrove appeared in the entrance to the cavern, a lantern held high. His face was cruel, scarred, a testament to a brutal life. Two of his men flanked him, their guns raised. His eyes fell on Jessamine, standing waist-deep in the pool, then to the open passage at her feet. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he sneered. "Looks like the lady found old Tucker's back door. Hand over the box, and I might just kill you quick." Jessamine stood her ground, Billy's revolver held tight in her hand, the cold water a numbing embrace. She had one gun, 6 shots. There were 3 of them. The odds were impossible. But she wasn't the same woman who had stepped off that stagecoach. She looked at Isaac, the man who had shown her a strength she never knew she possessed. She looked at Harrove, the man who embodied the greed that had destroyed her life. "You'll have to come and get it," she said, her voice clear and steady in the echoing cavern. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Harrove laughed, a harsh grating sound. "I like a woman with spirit." He nodded to one of his men. "Get the box." The man started forward, splashing into the pool. Jessamine didn't hesitate. She raised the revolver and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The man grunted, stumbling back with a hole in his shoulder. Before the echoes died, Harrove and his other man opened fire. Bullets skipped off the water around her, spraying her with icy droplets. She ducked beneath the surface, the underwater passage her only cover. She held her breath until her lungs screamed, then resurfaced, gasping for air. "Burn them out!" Harrove roared. The second man tossed his lantern into the narrow crevice they had entered from. Dry moss and ancient lichen caught fire, and the cavern began to fill with thick, choking smoke. They were trying to flush her out or suffocate them all. Panic clawed at her throat. She looked at Isaac. The smoke was swirling around his still form. She had to get him out. She had to get him through that underwater passage. She took a deep breath, dove back under, and swam through the dark tunnel. It was short, only about 15 feet long, and she emerged in another, smaller cavern, this one dry and with a clear passage leading upward toward the night air. She had found the way out. But Isaac was still on the other side. She swam back, emerging into the smoke-filled hell. Her eyes burned, her lungs ached. Harrove and his men were coughing, their shapes distorted by the haze. This was her only chance. Ignoring the threat of their guns, she scrambled out of the pool and grabbed Isaac under the arms. He was dead weight. She dragged him, inch by painful inch, back into the water. The effort was colossal. Her muscles screamed. "She's got the sheriff!" Harrove yelled through a fit of coughing. A bullet whizzed past her ear. She ignored it. She got Isaac to the edge of the underwater passage. "Isaac, wake up!" she pleaded, shaking him. "You have to help me." His eyes fluttered open, hazy with fever and pain. "Jessamine, we have to go. Through the water. You have to hold your breath." He seemed to understand. He nodded weakly. She took one last deep breath of the smoky air, pulled Isaac under with her, and kicked off into the darkness of the tunnel. It was a nightmare. He was a lead weight, and she was running out of air. Her vision started to gray at the edges. Just when she thought she would have to let him go, her head broke the surface. She gasped in the clean, cool air of the second cavern, dragging Isaac onto the dry ledge. He was unconscious again, but he was breathing. They were alive. They were through. But they weren't safe. She could hear Harrove and his men splashing through the tunnel behind them. They were only seconds behind. She dragged Isaac toward the passage leading out. It was a steep, narrow climb. She could never get him up it in time. They were trapped again. Then she saw it. A detail from Tucker's journal she had skimmed over. He wrote about the caves, about how he had shored up certain passages with timber, and he'd mentioned one spot, a deadfall trap he'd rigged near the exit, just in case anyone ever followed him. He'd drawn a little diagram, a key support beam, marked with his serpent symbol. She looked up. There, above the entrance to their cavern, was a network of heavy timbers, holding back tons of loose rock. And on one of them, barely visible, was a small, carved snake. Harrove and his wounded man stumbled out of the water. Harrove saw her, saw the passage leading up, and raised his pistol. Jessamine didn't aim for him. She aimed for the timber. She fired. The bullet struck the wood, splintering it. She fired again. The timber cracked. With a deafening groan, the entire support structure gave way. Harrove looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief as the ceiling of the cavern began to collapse. Rocks and dirt rained down. He didn't even have time to scream. The rock slide was a thundering avalanche, burying him and his man and sealing the underwater passage forever. Silence. Jessamine stood in the dust-choked air, the empty revolver smoking in her hand. It was over. She sank to her knees next to Isaac, utterly spent, and finally let herself cry. The climb out of the cave system was an ordeal. Jessamine, running on pure will, managed to half-drag, half-carry Isaac up the steep passage. They emerged onto the moonlit prairie, miles from where the ambush had taken place. They were free. She tended to his wound as best she could and built a small fire. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever still raging. In his delirium, he spoke of his past, of a father who was cruel and a mother who died too young. He spoke of Tucker, the man who had shown him what it was to be a good man. And he spoke of her, of the woman who walked out of the dust and into his town, a woman with fire in her eyes. For 3 days, she kept him alive. She hunted small game with the last of her bullets, found water, and used the knowledge she'd gleaned from Tucker's journal to find edible plants. She was no longer Jessamine Morgan of Boston. She was a survivor. On the 3rd day, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was the U.S. Marshal from Clearwater, drawn by the reports of the bank robbery and the missing posse. He looked at the disheveled woman and the wounded sheriff with suspicion until she produced Tucker's journal and the survey maps. As he read, his expression changed from disbelief to grim understanding. "We've been hunting the Harrove gang for 2 years," the marshal said. "But we always suspected they had help, someone powerful, feeding them information." He looked at the names in Tucker's journal, names of territorial judges, land agents, even a senator. Charles had not just been in business with outlaws, he'd been in business with the men who wrote the laws. "And Deputy Hawkins?" Jessamine asked. "He's in custody," the marshal said. He broke under questioning, confirmed everything in this journal. He also named the man in Redemption Creek who was pulling all the strings, the man who hired Harrove to kill Tucker, the man who arranged for Charles Morgan to buy the land and sent you there to retrieve the maps. Jessamine held her breath. "The town banker," the marshal said. "Elias Vance, the friendliest man in town." The betrayal was so profound it left her numb. The man who held the town's mortgages, who preached at church on Sundays, had been the serpent in the garden all along. They took Isaac back to Redemption Creek, not to the jail, but to the doctor's office. The town was in an uproar. The arrest of the banker had shattered their peaceful facade. Jessamine was no longer the subject of gossip. She was a figure of awe and mystery. The woman who had survived the Harrove gang and exposed the town's deepest rot. She sat by Isaac's bedside for a week, never leaving his side. The doctor said he was lucky to be alive. The bullet had missed his vital organs by an inch. On the 8th day, his fever broke. He woke up, and the first thing he saw was her face. "You're still here," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "Where else would I be?" she replied, a smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "When I was out there," he said, his hand finding hers, "thinking I was going to die. All I could think about was you. I should have told you before." "Told me what?" she asked softly. "That I love you, Jessamine," he said, his voice clear and strong. "From the moment I saw you standing in the street, determined to take on the world with nothing but a single trunk, I was lost." Tears welled in her eyes. "I love you too, Isaac." His kiss was gentle, a promise of a future she never thought she'd have. A future built not on the lies of the past, but on a hard-won, undeniable truth. As Isaac recovered, the territory was cleansed. The marshal, using Tucker's journal, rounded up the corrupt officials. The silver mine was properly registered, and by rights, it belonged to Jessamine. The wealth she had inadvertently stumbled upon was staggering, but she didn't care about the silver. One crisp autumn evening, as they sat on the porch of the now-repaired homestead, their homestead, Isaac turned to her. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have a grand speech. He just took her hand. "I'm not a man who has much to offer, just a badge and a scarred-up heart. You offered me your help when I had nothing," she said. "You fought for me. You trusted me. Your heart isn't scarred, Isaac. It's the strongest thing I've ever known." He knelt before her, on the porch of the cabin that had almost been their tomb. "Jessamine Morgan, will you marry me? Will you help me build a life here? Not on top of the secrets, but from the ashes." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." They were married by a traveling preacher as the first snow of winter began to fall. The whole town came. They weren't just the widow and the sheriff anymore. They were the foundation of a new Redemption Creek, one built on justice and courage. That night, in the warmth of the cabin, with a fire blazing on the hearth where a secret once lay hidden, Jessamine knew she was finally home. Her journey west had started as an ending, a sentence delivered by a dead man's failures, but it had been a beginning. She had lost a life built on lies and found a love forged in fire and truth. The prairie wind howled outside, but inside, wrapped in Isaac's arms, there was only a profound and peaceful silence. Their story was just getting started. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption and want to hear more tales from the shadows of history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You never know what secrets are buried just beneath the surface.